thank you, Dr. Metternich, and thanks to everyone for coming to this wonderful event. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here. These days, I actually kind of dip in and out of steady state economics and ecological macroeconomics because my day job, which thanks for not mentioning that, I actually work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the national office where I do conservation planning for the National Wildlife Refuge System. And it's a job in which this kind of stuff just isn't allowed. In fact, it's kind of beat out of you. So, you know, it's a rare opportunity to kind of put this hat back on, which is the hat I'd actually rather be wearing all the time. But, you know, it is what it is. You do what you can when you can. But partly as a function of that phenomenon, I decided instead of trying to reinvent a talk just for the conference, I'm going to go through basically this most recent book of mine, Supply Shock, which is still relatively fresh off the press, having come out last year, because I think it should provide the background for, you know, just what we're talking about. But before we do that, I actually want to kind of follow up on some of the acknowledgments. I'm glad that Dr. Metternich did that with the institutions, because I may not have had a complete list, but I definitely also want to emphasize the spectacular job that has been done by Hayden and Anna Schlunk and Sue Midgley and Jasmine Mignacchi. I'm sorry, that name is hard for me to get. Mignacchi. I believe that's pretty close to it. Sorry about that. And you know, these people, it's not easy to get support for this subject matter into such a prominent conference. So good job on that. And also my apologies to anyone who I may have missed in this list. In fact, kind of along those lines, I want to mention that Cassie has been blessed with a great amount of organic activity, if you will, in Australia. And so our first major contact in Australia was actually with Jeff Mosley. And so I think that his efforts over the years have borne some of the fruits that have led to conferences like this as well. So thanks to him and all of the people that have been involved in Cassie development in Australia. Cassie is a very loose-knit organization without a real, you know, power structure of organization. So we really depend upon the efforts of the, you know, independent and proactive efforts of people out there around the world. We have Cassie chapters around the world. The one thing that we have going for us in that regard is we have a concise position on economic growth, and it was designed to refute that rhetoric that there is no conflict between growing the economy and protecting the environment. I don't know how much you hear that around here. We heard that ad nauseum in the U.S. in the 90s, and it's really disgusting stuff. So we developed this position, and it's the one thing that absolutely unites, you know, anything having to do with that logo and our organization around the world. So those of you that haven't signed the position, it's back there on the table, and I hope you all do if you haven't. I know a lot of you have already. Thank you for that. Okay, so a little bit about the book. I started this thing about 15 years ago, fresh off of the preceding book called Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train, and this was intended to be a hybrid trade textbook that pretty much covers all the background, the major background pertaining to the need for and the establishment of a steady state economy. And it has four main parts: a background part, history, ecological econ, and politics and policy. So I'll try to interject some things that tailor it to the conference a little bit here and there, but pardon me if I never quite get to that. Boy, you know, the jet lag to come here is quite an excuse I have. So, but this part one on the background, it starts out with you know, some of you may have heard, especially our U.S. contingent there, it's the economy, stupid. Remember, that was the big campaign slogan of Clinton in 1992. And the thing is that he was using it, of course, to emphasize how much he was going to emphasize economic growth, as if that was going to benefit everybody and all the time. But what a lot of us in ecological economics have done is take a look at the problems around the world and connect the dots. And my gosh, you know, an awful lot of, maybe the vast majority, certainly of environmental problems, are all about the economy. So, you know, if we look around the world, you can see it, literally see it on the land. And when you fly, you see even more of it, a bigger picture of it, like this pivot agriculture in the state of Kansas in the U.S. But I would imagine Australia, you have, you know, from what I hear, some dire water and irrigation problems, both with water quantity and quality, and then the soil effects and so on. And so, you know, this is Saudi Arabia. Look at that depletion of that aquifer that's certainly happening under the desert. But you look around the world, maybe one or two of these are closer to home, and you know, it's one of the supply curves that's moving inward so rapidly that's one of the reasons I played with the word supply shock, you know, capital S, capital S. It's like these supply curves moving inward all at the same time, leading to, you know, a dire situation. And this pivot agriculture in this case is probably watering soybeans, probably Roundup Ready soybeans, one of the scariest ecosystems you'd want to set foot on. It's just one shade of brown and one shade of green, and extremely simplistic and vulnerable to ecological crisis. You know, but if you just go across the landscape, you can connect the dots. It's one sector after another: the agriculture, the logging, the mining, the domestic livestock growing. You know, and I'm skipping a lot of manufacturing sectors, but we go all the way up to some of the lightest, like computer chip manufacturing and the service sectors, and even the research and development services. It's all part of this integrated economy that's going to be a major part of the message here, I think, pretty soon. Of course, you have the infrastructure that kind of patches things together and helps connect the dots from sector to sector, as well as among the producers and consumers. And then, of course, in sort of an ultimate sense, you've got the energy sector itself. And at the other end of the tailpipe, if you will, you have some of the byproduct or co-product, the pollution. So, and it's all getting to be more and more, and I think I don't need to go into, I know that very early on in the conference there will be great elaboration on particular problems, and that'll be a downer, but you know, so we got to keep our mind on the forest and the big picture, and I think we can make a difference in this whole thing as time goes by. Okay, so you know, we can argue it's a case of good growing gone bad, you know, just to sort of capture the idea of growth changing from economic growth to actually uneconomic growth, as Herman Daly likes to refer to it, you know, causing more problems than it solves. But you know, whenever we start talking a lot about economic growth and the critique of it and alternatives, I think it's essential to define or just remind our audiences of what the definition is, because we don't want to leave slack in that, allowing all kinds of political rhetoric to fuzzy the picture or muddy the waters. You know, economic growth is simply increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate, and that's a key phrase, in the aggregate. We'll elaborate a bit on that in a second. And you know, so it's typically expressed in terms of gross domestic product. And it entails increasing population and or per capita production and consumption of goods and services. So nothing magical about it. It's very clearly defined, and it's fairly clearly measured, in fact. And this phrase, in the aggregate, I'm afraid, is lost too often and with too many problems as a result. So, you know, going back to the day job that I have, boy, I hope nobody snuck over from the U.S. Department of the Interior. But we can't really talk about it, and I know it's like that in a lot of federal agencies. Here, too, I'm guessing, to some degree. But I got to tell you, it's really bad in some parts of the world that way. You have to treat it like the 800-pound gorilla. You know it's there. You don't really talk about it. And so we'll just bring it out of the room there and actually see that growth? That's economic growth. It's in the aggregate. It's the whole darn critter. That's not economic growth. You know, because you're going to get the argument that, oh, wait a minute, we can shrink the oil sector and grow the renewable energy sector. And so there's no real conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. But that is not of itself economic growth. It's some sectoral readjustment that may, and very most likely will not, however, contribute to economic growth. You know, the aggregate increase in goods and services, production and consumption. That's economic growth. And it makes it much more easy to understand how there's such a basic, and we'll find out that it's a fundamental conflict physically and ecologically between growth and conservation. But yet, you know, it certainly won't be easy to overturn the pursuit of it, because in some of the most powerful institutions around, why it's pursued, you know, like the Federal Reserve headquarters in Washington, D.C., and the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the public and private sectors both, you know, in pursuit of GDP growth. And there's so many levers and buttons that contribute to that. Well, the historical part has these 3 chapters, which we're just going to be able to skim the slightest bits off of, especially in the case of the first 2, the classical econ, dealing with the dismal, you know, like Robert Malthus did and David Ricardo, and then later on, John Stuart Mill over there, probably should have labeled, but well, the dismal science was named such because these early folks that we, in hindsight, call economists, who themselves referred to their topic as political economy, one of their earlier foci was basically limits to growth. And, but then a lot of different things happened. There was this marginalist revolution in Europe that took it toward a microeconomic course, and there was the Marxist revolutions, and you know, that brought the attention more to the distribution of wealth and the unsustainability of laissez-faire capitalism and these kinds of things. And so the focus on limits to growth was lost, and in a lot of ways, was corrupted by a chapter in the development at the beginning of neoclassical economics, we could call dealing with the devil, because what happened here was about the time political economy began to proliferate in American academia and public circles. Henry George writes Progress and Poverty. It's published in 1879, and by some accounts sells more copies than any nonfiction book prior to the 20th century, or prior to 1911 is the factoid I read some time back. His primary point is that, unlike with Marx's focus on the capitalist advantage in a political economy, his most unjust advantage was that of the landlord. And this is at a time when landlording was at its all-time most inequitable maybe in the world, with the land barons of the U.S., you know, the Rockefellers and the like. And it's also at a time when the tax code is being developed. It's in some of its most formative and rapidly forming stages. And it's at the time, it's in the wake of Marxist revolutions, and it's in the wake of the marginalist revolution, and neoclassical econ is being born. And so it results in a backlash because of its endangerment of the land baron with big money, you know. So he's running up against big money. And if you read a book by Mason Gaffney called The Corruption of Economics, you can see that, you know, I'm not just piping off here. Mason Gaffney, the economic historian's well-developed thesis, is all about how at this university and that university things were designed to prevent that single tax on land. And universities tended to have a very vested interest in that, because in the U.S. they're based largely, their financing was upon public lands that had been granted to them, so which they managed for income. And so, you know, this pitted Henry George against some of the earlier and formative neoclassical economists like John Bates Clark, and going on for decades in the development of, well, neoclassical econ in general, and the earlier stages of macroeconomics and growth theory and that's what's really relevant to us. You know, we don't have to deal with all of the aspects of this corruption of economics, but this one we do have to deal with, and that's why I spent so much time on it in Supply Shock. And we come to this bit about modern growth theory, not of this earth. And it's, you know, it's not just, there's some meaning to that way of putting it, because our modern growth theory, you know, starting with the Solo model in the 50s and leading through some of the more major transformations of it with Robert Lucas and Paul Romer, it's all revolved around this landless production function. And that is itself a function of that corruption of economics, where land was excised as a distinct factor of production, either being dismissed entirely or being obfuscated or you know, melded with capital. So it was a way to avoid that single tax on land from happening. And but this means that we have inherited this ecologically depauperate central component of growth theory. And so, you know, Robert Solo's model gave rise to developments, and I'll talk more about Romer's development of the growth model. It's very important for us, extremely important, what he did and our response to it. But it also led to sort of a abuse of growth theory by what who we might call pop economists. I think it's fair to do that with some of the types of claims that were made by folks like Julian Simon, for example. And that type of rhetoric that came out of the landless production function then led to politicians like Jack Kemp here. You know, I can picture it yet. His debate with Al Gore was about 1999, I suppose, and old Jack Kemp said, "We should double the rate of growth, and we should double the size of the American economy." You know, and he wasn't talking about during the 21st century. He was talking about like in the hoped for 8 years of their coming administration. It was crazy, and he was redder than a beet when he was, you know, laying that out. But that's the kind of rhetoric that followed naturally from the pop econ, which followed ultimately from the corrupted base of neoclassical growth theory with the land, this production function that tells us that production is just a function of capital and labor, and just leaves land out of the picture. So, you know, and when you see it schematically in an intro business book, and even in a lot of econ textbooks, you will see the result of that landless production function hooked loosely to the monetary sector with the circular flow of money, with labor and capital sectors and circulating material goods and services, and the money for them being exchanged. And, you know, so kind of the vision is you just have a growing circular flow, and hopefully more efficient, but, you know, growing is the main thing. Efficient is another. And neither one of those get us to where we want to go in terms of a stabilized economy that'll fit on the planet. And you know, I don't know how, I have a hard time understanding, actually. I think some of us as ecologists originally, those of us who were originally ecologists and then went into econ, or that had a lot of ecological background to begin with, they find it astounding that there have ever been questions about, is there a limit to growth? It seems kind of nutty. Now, when you really dig into it, you can see how the nuttiness happens, especially in the absence of thermodynamics and all that. We'll get a little into that. But still, I think you could have always just said, hey, you know, to think that there is no limit to economic growth on a finite landmass like Earth, you know, that is mathematically precisely equivalent to saying that you could have a steady state economy, let's say a $12 trillion global economy, on a perpetually diminishing landmass. It's the same thing, so that, you know, you could fit the 12 trillion into Australia, you know, leaving the rest of where I am there in North America as a designated wilderness area. You guys handle the, you know, the growthmanship here. And you could eventually, you wouldn't have a problem either, because you could fit it into New South Wales. And you guys out in Canberra and in the snowy mountains and stuff, you get tired of it, just shove it into Sydney. You know, and you get tired there, you can fit it into this conference room. It's crazy stuff, and it's mathematically is crazy, that's saying there's no limit to growth. So, you know, that shouldn't, you should easily be able to overcome that if you get into arguments about it. Now, we go into an overview of econ in Chapter 6 of Supply Shock. I think for this crowd, that's probably not really very necessary. One of my efforts with Supply Shock, though, was to try to add some value really from an ecological angle. Econ has been largely econ with ecological insights, and I would say that there needs to be a really ecologically based economics for it to make really sustainable sense. And so this Chapter 7, I want to spend some time talking about what I call the trophic theory of money. I think it's a missing link in the sustainability dialogue. We'll see. Technological progress also is something that we've got to get better on dealing with. We'll talk about how it may lead to less brown growth. But in terms of the overview, you know, especially the ecological macro with our identification of the steady state economy as a sustainable alternative to growth. Herman Daly is really our primary, the person we can attribute that to, and also, of course, with Dana Meadows and the Limits to Growth folks. And, you know, they had this iconic graph about demonstrating how, well, yeah, there's the economy, like a circular flow of money, but it exists within, you know, the context of a planet. And so it's so much more impressive than the landless production function. So it was, I think it opened a lot of eyes. I remember, I should mention the way I got into this subject, and Dr. Metternich alluded to this. So I was a biologist, and I was a big game biologist. I had fun out in the field with elk and deer and all that kind of stuff. And then I maybe made the mistake in some ways of going into conservation biology with more of a focus on biodiversity conservation. So I did this policy analysis of the Endangered Species Act for my PhD, and part of it was documenting the causes of species endangerment in the United States, and I broke it down into 18 categories, and in the process of doing that, it just struck me one day that, hey, this list, this is just a who's who of the American economy. And so the next step in this model of policy analysis I was using required that you look at then what is the context within which this policy, in this case the Endangered Species Act, has to function. And at this time in the 90s, like I mentioned before, we had the rhetoric that there is no conflict between growing the economy and protecting the environment. So, I had to go heavily into this, and when I found this type of literature, Herman's literature in particular, with this graph, I thought, there's the place to be academically. And from then on, I focused on this and tried to help bring this into other parts of academia and into the natural resource professions. So, and also, I kind of prefer a little more, a little different take on that graphic, which is to show that circular flow. We don't deny there's circular flow, but to see what happens as it does grow, the depletion of natural capital stocks and the flows of ecosystem services and the increase in the levels of pollutants and waste heat, and to show that there really is a limitation to that based on the planet and those stocks of capital and flows. So with the trophic theory of money, it's something that is based on, well, actually I want to mention a little observation I had in the years between my master's research, which is an elk study in the state of Washington, and the PhD, which happened years later. In between, I'm working for the San Carlos Apache tribe in Arizona, and they, on their reservation, have the largest elk in the world. Phenomenally awesome elk. I mean, the elk there were such that the tribe annually would sell, they hated to sell permits to non-Apaches, even non-San Carlos Apaches. But they would sell a handful of permits every year to help with the tribal coffers. And at that time, this was early 90s, we'd sell 3 tags to non-tribal members, pretty much to the highest bidder. And the one year we sold 3 tags for $43,000 a piece. At the time, those were the highest selling elk tags in the world. And so we had $129,000 from the 3 tags. And the money was earmarked via Game and Fish Commission order for elk habitat improvement or acquisition. We actually got a grazing lease from a cattle association with that money. So at first glance you'd think, well, you can reconcile economic growth with environmental protection or growing the tribal economy. Somebody was growing their part of the economy to get there, and now we're protecting all this elk habitat. But it started bothering me when 2 of the tags were actually bought by the owner of the largest old-growth sawmill in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, Seneca sawmills. And so $86,000. And how was that money generated? The elk didn't generate it. This talk about sustainable ecotourism and generation of monies from, wow, no, somebody in the Pacific Northwest had to do this kind of thing, had to liquidate that kind of natural capital, Sitka spruce in that case, to really generate the money to bring to fly in with the private Learjet, with a pilot by the name of John Glenn, no less, to fly in on a Learjet to San Carlos and spend the $89,000, as well as a whole pile of other money on guides and guns and, you know, all kinds of things, to be able to hunt those elk. So eventually, when I got to this conflict, parent conflict at the time between growth and biodiversity, I thought back to Seneca Sawmill, San Carlos elk, and thought about the trophic level training. And, you know, there was always the emphasis that the human economy is operates by the same general rules as the economy of nature. And in that economy, it's based on the producers, or the plants. They're called producers because they literally produce via photosynthesis their own food, and then surplus that is consumed firstly by primary consumers, like herbivores, and then by secondary consumers, carnivores. And, you know, there aren't going to be too many different really distinct trophic levels, because the diminishment of biomass and energy is by orders of magnitude as you go up, you know. But if you have certainly you will have some species toward the top you might identify as super carnivores, you know, grizzly bears or polar bears and bald eagles and things like that. And then in the kind of mixed among those obvious trophic levels are what we might consider service providers, you know, scavengers and pollinators and soil aerators and things that don't really make decomposers, that don't seem to live so clearly among those trophic levels, but clearly are major players in the economy of nature. Now, philosophically, you may want to say, you may object, well, wait a minute, where's old Homo sapiens? And, well, we can think of a human-inclusive economy of nature easily enough. In that case, Homo sapiens is the super carnivore. Right? And so it's at the top, and then the service providers are a mix of human and non-human elements, you know. And this way of envisioning the economy, I think, helps us to understand the basic trade-off between economic growth and biodiversity conservation, because think of the human economy on top there as a subset of the economy of nature. And so, you know, that's what economic growth looks like, and that's what it does. You know, there was that much human economy, and now there's that much, and it's sort of a trophic compression of the non-human species in the rest of the economy of nature. And that's why when you look at the causes of endangerment, it's a who's who of the human economy. Here's another way of looking at it. You know, as the economy grows, it's just a reallocation of natural capital, the woods, water, soils, minerals, fisheries, petroleum products, and from the old economy of nature, even pre-human, on into the human economy, where all that natural capital is converted into producer and consumer goods and services, and manufactured capital and infrastructure. So it's a reallocation, but there's a carrying capacity. That is a basic principle of ecology. And once again, Homo sapiens, as part of that economy of nature, doesn't escape that. And the wildlife and fisheries professions did eventually latch onto these things. If we wanted to advance the steady state economy in the U.S., I would, and in a lot of other countries, I'm not sure about the situation here, but it would be prudent to build upon a lot of the efforts that have already transpired in places like the Wildlife Society, which published this special issue on ecological economics. And you see the sigmoid curve, the economy is sort of coming out of the proverbial wilderness, and it's at first it's infringing upon these large-bodied or K-selected species, and it's coming out of the wilderness, developing its agro-extractive sectors and heavy manufacturing, and all the way to the inner city core there with light services. And by that time, with this level of technology, it's also endangering the little R-selected insect species and such. So, you know, it's the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection is no more evident than it is in the case of biodiversity conservation. Now, the service providers, a little bit about them. The other thing that happens in the process of economic growth is that the allocation of ecosystem services to the human inclusive economy of nature changes proportionally from non-human provision to human provisioning of ecosystem services. But you think there's no limit to that? You know, at some point it becomes a lot more expensive to pollinate crops, for example, by hand or with manufactured capital than for having had the relatively free service of the natural ecosystem services. And then some things just aren't substitutable as well. So that's another little aspect of things. And then another aspect is the human economy itself has its, as a subset of the human inclusive economy of nature's trophic structure, its substructure, which is structured in the same general fashion, namely as founded upon producers, the agricultural and extractive sectors. And these are the sectors, the surplus from which is what frees the hands for the division of labor and makes money a meaningful concept and something that can be exchanged for other goods and services. And that's the part, I feel this part is missing way too much in, and it's explainable why it's missing. There are political reasons, but also, you know, this would have been another way of describing what people like, frankly, Adam Smith did in Chapter 4 of The Wealth of Nations on the origins of money, how agricultural surplus freed the hands. But eventually, with the episode in The Corruption of Economics where we got the landless production function, this type of thinking is long gone. So you're not going to find this in very many books, and I'm afraid most econ books even. But this is how the human economy has got to be structured thermodynamically. You know, you've got the agro-extractive sectors, and then the heavy manufacturing sectors are built upon them, and then ever lighter manufacturing sectors upon them. And the service sectors, as in the economy of nature, they aren't necessarily obviously associated with particular trophic levels, but they operate through the rest of the system. And what this points out, here's another thing I think is missing at our great expense, so to speak, is what money really means and what GDP really means in terms of its connection to throughput. I am one of those people through the trophic theory of money that would say that you don't unhitch them, you don't decouple GDP from throughput because of the trophic structure of the economy. This notion about an ever more service provisioning economy, what are they talking about? I mean, you know, what are these services going to be used for? If they're not usable by all these other sectors, you know, like information, for example, what's it being used for that makes it contribute to economic growth? Oh, it's being used by, you know, razor-sharp wheat combines. It's being used by, you know, those massive computer chip manufacturing operations that we saw the slide of earlier, and all the sectors in between. If not, it's not going to get past the invisible hand of the market. It's going to be meaningless as pertains to economic growth. So, you know, this is the implication of the trophic theory of money. The fact that this is the implication is that the real money supply and real money expenditures and the real circular flow of money, which is reflected, I would say, most readily in GDP. Because remember, GDP is calculated as a matter of production, expenditure, and income. And so the expenditure accounting phase of GDP reflects the size of the real economy, the production in the economy. And the reason it reflects it so precisely is because it's stemming from the amount of productive activity, especially the agro-extractive surplus at the base. Yeah, so there's that circular flow again, and the trophic theory of money helps you to understand how that is a fine, fine measure of ecological footprint. You know, we all agree that GDP is a horrible indicator of wealth these days, or indicator of well-being. It's bad at that, and so we're trying to replace it with GPI. But I'm afraid that there may be kind of some overreaction to that at times. I think our response pertaining to GDP is that we need to stop interpreting the numbers differently, not just throw it out. It's kind of like shooting the messenger to just get rid of it. Or it's like if you were a doctor and you had an obese patient. You don't be telling the patient to throw away the scale. That would be the most dangerous advice you could give at that point. In fact, at that point, you want the scale to be used even more. You want very close attention being paid by the patient to that number on the scale. And so I think that's the way we have to treat GDP. It's just that what we have to do is view it now as alarming as it bloats instead of cheering on the growth of it. It's something to scare people. It's something to, you know, tell us the problem is worsening, and here's our indicator. And then use other metrics. Actually, I think there's some slides on this. So, you know, the limit to growth applies precisely as well to the limits of real money, adjusted for inflation, adjusted for technological progress. We'll get into that a little bit yet. Adjusted for technological progress, and adjusted for what I call the propensity to use money. It's kind of related to Keynesian's liquidity preference, but it's basically these things remaining equal, or ceteris paribus. GDP is a perfectly good measure of ecological footprint in a nutshell. It also has implications, the trophic theory of money, to the push for developing markets for ecosystem services, because like I alluded to earlier, you know, these supply shocks are moving inward, and therefore it's making it more evident that ecosystem services are more and more valuable. Valuable enough, in fact, that people want to actually put a price in the market on and develop markets to sell them. But with the trophic theory of money, and I think your common trophic sense as an ecologist as well, there's a conundrum here, because if you're not dropping anything out of the economy, but only foisting another sub-market into the bigger market, how's that money going to be generated? And it goes back to Aaron Jones and the Seneca Sawmill and the Dry Lake elk herd. You have to have the agro-extractive surplus at the base to generate the money to pay to invest in the ecosystem services. So it's not the way out to throw money at the problem. Yeah, the way you might look at it is more is needed, natural capital that is, to spend now on these new sectors, but less is had by virtue of the the trophic necessity and the generation of money. This, about 2 months ago, I gave a talk at MIT, and it was on investment. And I just thought it tied in real nicely with the trophic theory. And serendipitously, that morning on the campus paper, they had this cartoon because Boston was going through the complaints about what fire pensions were costing the taxpayer. And so you see the poor taxpayer down there, he's yelling for the police because he's getting run over by these fire pensions. Well, there come the police. They're not really helping matters, are they? Because all of this, the connection to our ecological macro may not be, precise just yet, but if you think about it a little later, it'll strike you as being what we just talked about. Throwing money at the problems is not the solution. Especially in the case of environmental problems, it only flattens the conservationist even more. So I'm afraid that we have to have, I might be getting ahead of things just a little bit. We have all conference, I think, to talk about what that really means for like NGO strategy and things like that. But despite all this, we have this notion of the environmental Kuznets curve, whereby, oh yeah, even the neoclassical economist will acknowledge that problems are solved, environmental problems, as the economy grows, but then eventually when you get enough wealth assembled, especially per capita, well, then you can fix the problems. You can buy your way out of them. Trophic theory of money gives the lie to that, and it dismisses that. You can view the environmental Kuznets curve as perhaps having some isolated microeconomic validity of sorts in specific cases, but no, not macroeconomically. It's fallacious as can be in terms of ecological principles. Well, but it is related in a way to this whole issue of technological progress, because one of the arguments is if you have enough money, you can study your way out of the problem by developing new technology to get around whatever the problem is. And viewed macroeconomically, once again, this kind of brings you back to that thing about, is there a limit to economic growth on a finite planet? And I think we figured out early on, yeah, of course there's a limit. So then what about technological progress? The whole idea there is you should be able to get more output per unit input, right? But for how long? And, without thinking that there's any limit to that, that's how we wound up with Nobel Prize winning economists getting away with saying things like the world can, in effect, get along without natural resources. Yeah, and once again, beyond the Nobel Prize winners, you have, various versions of Julian Simon disciples out there saying even more astounding things, that natural resources originate from the mind, not the ground, and therefore are not depletable. Well, we have to have a way to refute this fellow won an award for this type of argument. Yeah, well, it happened to be the Julian Simon Award, but yeah, but I mean that's sponsored by the Competitive Enterprise Institute, I think. So they have a following, and this type of stuff gets out to their masses, and we have to counter that. And you can do it academically with laws of thermodynamics, which convert very readily into economic principles. You can't get something from nothing, like the first law tells you in a nutshell, and you can't get ever more efficient. You can't get 100% efficient, much less even more than 100% efficient, which would also violate the first law. So, we can refute them till the cows come home in academic debates and things like that. But I'm afraid it's just not, it's too late, and it's too little in the sense of resonating with not the masses. You know, it'll resonate with the limited subset in academia. I'm not saying it's unimportant. It's extremely important because it ultimately is the bedrock of, well, it's the bedrock of the trophic theory of money, for example. But, oh my gosh, 10 minutes. Well, we're just going to have to get the laser gun going and blast right on through this. So the research and development is how we're supposed to get the technological progress. How do you get that? Well, you get it from economic surplus. In the private sector, that means profits. But, you know, economists of all ilks have described in great detail how systemically the profits dry up in competitive economies, which are the same ones that offer the hope for technological progress. So then what do? Well, you know, the argument is, well, it doesn't dry up for those firms that maintain or establish a competitive advantage. Well, how do they do that? Profits. So what are we at? We have kind of a catch-22. You need the profits to maintain the R&D, but you need the R&D to maintain the profits. It's kind of a catch-22, or kind of a chicken-egg thing. See that chicken saying, no, you back off. I was here before you. You know, it doesn't really matter. If you want more chickens and more eggs, you need more eggs and more chickens. And you have to have more and more R&D, and therefore more and more profits to have this growing economy and have any hope of somehow delinking the process from throughput growth as well. So what gives here? Is it really a catch-22 that's we can't overcome, or does something else explain it? And I argue in Chapter 8 that it can be explained by this one phenomenon. Wait for it. It's called, what is it? Oh yeah, economies of scale. That's it. That's it. I mean, if you read, what's his name's, the History of Economic Thought from David Hume to the you will find this. You will find very nicely in tabular form by Edward Denison the sources of national income growth, and this is one of them. And for us, it happens to break the catch-22. Economies of scale, yeah, it's increased efficiency also, but concomitantly with growth based on the given technology. So that's your way out of the catch-22. You can fund more and more R&D, keep the cycle of profits in R&D going with economies of scale. Well, that's economies of scale. That thing on the right is way more efficient than the thing on the left. Does it look more sustainable? Well, no. See, what this is, if you're familiar with Jevons paradox, this is the macroeconomic explanation for Jevons paradox. I mean, this is the explanation for macroeconomic Jevons paradox. It's not really paradoxical at all. And, you know, we see that even the research and development in a direct sense has its own footprint, but that's not even the main point. The main point is with the trophic structure, you have to have more ecological footprint to grow the economy in the aggregate, including the R&D sectors. And then you've got the tailpipe with things that you will have as a matter of probabilities and physical and chemical reactions. You will have things like the BP oil spill approaching New Orleans there. So you've got to think about scale again, and you know, the steady state economy should really be easy for you to argue for, because you can say that, you know, perpetual growth, growth is not sustainable in any long term. Degrowth sure isn't sustainable. So that leaves you with a basic third alternative, steady state economy. Does that mean that at a given level of GDP it's optimal? Well, no. That's what you're going to have to struggle with. when we get to the paradigm shift away from growth to a steady state, then there's going to be a lot of politics, hopefully democratically conducted, to deal with these differences in preference. But this, the idea is to find the democratic optimum, and then, as they say in poli-sci, muddle toward the optimum. Another way of looking at it, like Herman would call it, past the optimum, you're into uneconomic growth, so it's just dumb. It's 5 minutes to go. So, there it is from their graph where the marginal disutility exceeds the marginal utility. Dumb. Okay, so some other metrics that help you to muddle toward the optimum would be, don't give up the GDP, because it tells you how unoptimal you're getting just in terms of size. But then you've got all these other things that help to piece together. And that'll help you in the political and policy arena. But the main thing there is you've got to put the horse before the cart. And we're going to entirely skip this chapter 9, which is a history of the politics of economic growth. But that chapter, more than any others, is American focused. Does have some observations, though, which you might find interesting. You can even thumb through some of the pictures toward the end that tell you some interesting factoids about other places in the world regarding that. I do want to very quickly mention the idea of the Hummer haters and this idea of a steady state revolution. Boy, this is something I got beat out of me after I wrote Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train. Well, frankly, partly because 9/11 happened. And that instantly changed the dynamics in the United States about any sorts of class-based distinction making, especially when Americans were told to go shopping and go to Disney World to show them that, these events weren't going to slow us down from GDP growth. Well, okay, so prior to that, and I think little by little these days we can return to recognizing that, just like the smoker was castigated back in the 70s in the U.S., and kind of like the conspicuous consumer was pricked a little bit by Thorstein Veblen back in 1900 with the theory of the leisure class, there is some potential, especially given Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where self-esteem is a major motivational factor. That means that there's some potential to do what was done, frankly, to the poor smoker, which was better for them ultimately, right? They got healthier because they were socially constructed as, Now, people have told me, Jack, get off it. You're not a psychologist, or, just stick with the ecology and maybe some econ and just forget about this stuff. And no, I don't think so. Like I say, you got to put the horse before the cart. And, otherwise, well, which one of these things is going to work? I mean, I don't know about you. I wouldn't hold a lot of faith in that first one there, right? That second one's been empirically demonstrated not to work. So I think it's only that one that's really going to work. You got to put the horse before the cart. You have to establish as an explicit policy goal a steady state economy and talk about it. Don't go slinking around the bush to say, oh, what are we talking about? A new economy, a steady state economy. That's growth, that's degrowth, that's a steady state economy. It's not that hard to say. So, and this then leads to what we might call steady statesmanship in international diplomacy, which includes that explicit goal of a steady state economy beginning in large, wealthy, with 1 minute to go, nations that can afford it, frankly. And then you can get, another low-hanging fruit is the second bullet. There are so many fiscal, monetary, and trade policies that are currently explicitly intentionally set to help stimulate the economy. Well, then the decisions made on those, like the interest rate by the Fed, those are changed. The discussion changes at the cabinet level, or the ministerial level, you know, about decisions that are made. It's no longer viewed as such a great thing if it's contributing to GDP growth. And then you have the obvious policy tables that also require proactive actions. And yeah, so then this leads to the international diplomacy aspect. You know, I feel like something was missed from that, the conspicuous consumption bit. I think one of the main points there is that theoretically you wouldn't need any policy reforms to establish a steady state economy. And Keynes, had he been here today, I think would tell us, yeah, that's for sure. Frankly, all you would really need to affect is the propensity to consume. And so it can be done entirely in the private sector. Propensity to consume and procreate. Yeah, of course, because you have to have stable population and per capita consumption. But you don't need policy one for either of those if you have widespread public awareness and responsible social interpretation of behaviors pertaining to the biggest challenge in the 21st century of sustainability. So we're almost done here. You know, UN is a promising place for steady statesmanship, and certainly other venues are needed. Places like G20s have to be compensated for with, you know, I have this hope for a G100 based on starting from the bottom per capita income, that are united by no other thing. This would alleviate so many nasty pressures. Time's up, yep. But you can develop solidarity and discourage that conspicuous consumption, and then, you know, you'd use the ecological footprint, you'd backtrack it. As a biologist, we can do some backtracking. And then, you know, with the trophic theory of money, you don't even really need the ecological footprint. You know why? Because you already have it. Because GDP is a fine indicator of environmental impact. So you backtrack that as well. And then ultimately, the last slide here, you know, your goal is to get the economy of the planet below global carrying capacity, and in the process reassemble the chairs a little bit and have some equitability and fairness, and so the idea is to get to where at least on the grounds of financial characteristics and so forth, there aren't so many enemies. There certainly are going to be other things yet. And at the same time, you solve the poverty problem through contraction and convergence. So that's I see there was a little bit of animation I was slow on. But that's that. So thanks for listening to that. And then just as a PS, if you haven't done this already, much obliged if you do. Thank you.